Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on brown marmorated stink bugs, Invasion, Biology, Monitoring, and Management by Ann Nielsen of Rutgers University. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. We're very excited to have Ann Nielsen with us today. Dr. Nielsen is an assistant extension specialist in fruit entomology at Rutgers University. She was one of the first researchers to study brown marmorated stink bugs, and she has been trying to decipher its complex biology, behavior, and management for nearly 10 years. In this webinar, she'll be discussing background information on BMSB Biology and population ecology, including identification and distribution. She'll also include a preliminary discussion of management tactics that are amenable to organic production systems, including organic insecticides and biological control. Future webinars will discuss management in more detail.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. As Alice mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about some background information about brown marmorated stink bug, as well as provide you some of the tools that we're using. Alice, this isn't, oh, there it is. Some of the tools that we're using to develop some organic management programs, which is part of a funded project through the USDA OREI program, the Organic Research and Extension Initiative. So I'd like to, first of all, thank some of my contributors, Tracy Leskey from the USDA ARS Tree Fruit Lab in Kearneysville, West Virginia, Dr. Yonglok Park of West Virginia University, and Dr. Clarissa Mathews from Shepherd University and of Redbud Farms. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on brown marmorated stink bug for those of you who are not familiar with this pest. Its scientific name is Haliomorpha halis, which essentially means mottled. It is native to Asia and is found in Japan, South Korea, China, and Taiwan. And in those countries, it's considered to be an agricultural pest, but an occasional or outbreak pest. However, the number of scientific publications on this particular bug has increased dramatically in about the last 15 years, and for unknown reasons. So it may be that we're seeing some similarities here, but there's some issues related to the fact that it is an invasive species that make it even more complicated in terms of management. Interestingly enough, brown marmorated stink bug is also a homeowner nuisance, and this is a similar behavior to the Asian ladybird beetle that you may be familiar with, where it overwinters inside human-made structures such as houses and can cause a considerable concern to homeowners. We first found brown marmorated stink bug around 1996 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is on the eastern edge of Pennsylvania, pretty close to the border of New Jersey. And at that time, its seasonality and damage and control methods were unknown, not only here in the US, but there was very little information available to us as researchers from its country of origin. And this is mostly just due to differences in language and the way we could access publications. As an invasive species, however, it was introduced without its cohort of predators that can naturally keep the populations at low levels. And this is pretty common with invasive species, but because of some of the behaviors of stink bugs, this is a huge burden that we have to overcome, especially in organic production. Some of the new information that's coming out right now, based on the molecular data, suggests that this is a single introduction, which means it only came over once from China, which will really help when we try to identify more information about its biology and natural enemies if we know the location of the population. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history here. In the early years, Alice mentioned that I have been working on BMSB for about 10 years, and Rutgers was one of the first universities to start working with this. So at that time, around 2003, stink bugs were primarily a secondary pest in the Mid-Atlantic region, which meant that their management programs were kind of lumped together with other cat-facing insects such as lygus bug or the tarnished plant bug. And so these pests have different similarities, different seasonalities, and also different susceptibility to management programs such as insecticides or natural enemies. And so we didn't have any species-specific management programs, at least in tree fruit for stink bugs. But they were kind of becoming a pest that was increasing in awareness because of some of the changes in insecticide chemistry. Now, the populations that were in Allentown, Pennsylvania were first reported by Karen Bernhardt of Penn State Cooperative Extension. And she was basically seeing these large populations of the stink bug, and it wasn't fitting with what we normally see. And so she brought this to the attention of some researchers, including Rutgers. And one of the first things that we did was go out and look at numerous host plants and determined that, in fact, the population was significantly higher than our native stink bugs in stink bug species. So we don't know if it was actually outcompeting them, but we were finding them in higher numbers. And we were seeing a large number of host plants that included both ornamentals, tree fruit, and specialty crops, as well as agronomic crops such as soybean. However, the big question, of course, becomes, was it going to become a pest? So Gary Bernon of USDA APHIS had written a report in 2004 where he predicted that BMSB would become the next Japanese beetle. And in many ways, his predictions have unfortunately held true. Despite this fact, the brown marmorated stink bug was not placed under quarantine. It was considered to be an established insect that may not become a pest. However, the USDA researchers started working on the pheromone, which is a useful monitoring tool. The pheromone that was available at the time was the pheromone of another species in Asia, so it's what we call a chiromone, and it was attractive to brown marmorated stink bug both in the nymphs and the adults, but only during the late season. And so as a monitoring tool, this wasn't very ideal. And here at Rutgers University, what we started doing was to determine if it was going to become a pest by looking at the spread of this pest as well as its biology and trying to guide that into management programs. We know that we started seeing severe injury in tree fruit in northern New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania as early as 2006. And of course, then in 2010, we had a very large population explosion. Interestingly enough, probably because stink bugs are grouped together with some of these other insects, the current management programs were ineffective. And so we needed to kind of start over in terms of our management programs. However, in 2010, the populations experienced this very large increase. I'm sure many of you have already heard about this. And as of right now, starting in 2010 to 2012, we're seeing a fourfold increase in insecticide application, even in conventional systems. And this is really concerning because it's not a very sustainable practice, in both environmentally sustainable or economically sustainable for our growers. Now, here's the current distribution of brown marmorated stink bug. In 1996, it was only in Allentown, Pennsylvania here. In 1999, it was first found in New Jersey. And currently, our populations are centered here in the mid-Atlantic states in red. And this is where we're seeing severe agricultural problems and economic loss and nuisance problems. But if you see in orange here, these outlying states, they are starting to increase in agricultural importance in these states. Now, it is found in 39 states plus Ontario. And so the populations are increasing and spreading, and we actually expect this map to change a little bit over the next few years. So one of the key things that you have to do in order to understand the biology of this bug is that you need to properly identify brown marmorated stink bug versus some of our native stink bug species. There's a few stink bug species that are easily misidentified as brown marmorated stink bug. The first is Bronchomena species, or the rough stink bug. These are an arboreal species commonly found on trees. And as you can see, they do look pretty similar. They're about the same size as brown marmorated stink bug, but they have a very heavy toothed pronotum along the shoulders here. The brown stink bug is one of a complex of stink bugs that are also native, and they look pretty similar. They don't have the white stripes on the antennae. Now, brown marmorated stink bug can easily be distinguished from both of these species by the white banding on the antennae. We used to say that they can also be identified by this black and white banding along the edges of the abdomen, but as you can see, the other species have that as well. In addition to the white banding, one really good characteristic is this smooth pronotum, or the shoulder of the stink bug. So that's this area right here. You can see that with a hand lens. In our native species, including the rough stink bug and the brown stink bugs, they have a toothed or jagged edge here along the edges of the pronotum or the shoulders, whereas brown marmorated stink bug has a very smooth shoulder, at least in the adult stages. So that's another good characteristic. This white banding is present.
Unmuted.
Stars beginning at the second instar. As a stink bug, it goes through 5 nymphal instars, increasing in size. And another good characteristic to identify brown marmorated stink bug nymphs is that they have, beginning at the third instar, they have this white band on the middle of their legs. And that's present through the third, fourth, and fifth instars. So here's a couple pictures just to give you a relative idea of what nymphs can look like in the field. This marking here, this is a product of their feeding. This is their exudate. As they feed, they will secrete fluids as a result of their feeding. But you can easily see the white banding as on the antennae and on the legs to help you distinguish it. These are the first instars. You will often see them aggregated around the egg mass. So another way that that you can distinguish brown stink bugs from brown marmorated stink bug is to flip them over. The brown stink bugs have a green underside of the abdomen, whereas brown marmorated stink bug is kind of a gray or white with black spots. So that's another good way to identify it, especially if you don't have a hand lens available. Now we have some other species of insects that look similar to stink bugs in general. Stink bugs, you have to remember, are shield-shaped insects. So they are wider at the shoulders across here than they are at the tip of the abdomen. These bugs, the leaf-footed bug and the squash bug, are more oval or U-shaped here, where the shoulders are about as wide as the widest part of the abdomen. And they also tend to have very long legs. So these two bugs are commonly confused with stink bugs, especially brown marmorated stink bug. The squash bug is present in very high numbers in the fall on your squash plantings, especially in organic systems. They can be found on your pumpkins or your other winter squash. Their nymphs do look different. They are green and black instead of red, white, and black than brown marmorated stink bug. All right, so in terms of the biology, it's really important in any type of system to understand the biology and the seasonality of the
Muted.
control. And this is really important for brown marmorated stink bug because its biology is so difficult. It's very complex. So the adults overwinter inside human-made structures such as houses. Some of you those of you who have seen brown marmorated stink bug before know that they will do this in very high numbers. We have had some individuals with 26,000 in their house in a single year. That's the extreme. They will also overwinter in dead upright trees, not this live healthy tree. So they do overwinter some in the landscape, but I don't believe it's as many as will overwinter inside human-made structures or cliff outcroppings. So they overwinter inside as adults. They are not nesting, they are not reproducing, and they are not mating. Or they're not feeding. So they are simply just hibernating during this time, even though they are active. And you will see them more frequently on warm days than on you'll see them more frequently on warm days. They will gradually emerge from these overwintering sites in the spring, and during this time they are reproductively immature. So there's a lag time here before they can start producing offspring. Once they move into the landscape, they will go to one of their 100 host plants. And will go through anywhere from 1 to 5 generations per year, depending on the location. And again, they have 5 nymphal instars. The resulting adult stage will then return to a new overwintering site in the fall again, where they will again spend the winter. Now, I mentioned that brown marmorated stink bug has over 100 host plants. This highly prolific behavior makes management programs very difficult. We know that they are a season-long pest of peach, and in fact, peaches are one of their early season host plants. They are also a season-long pest of sweet corn, attacking sweet corn very early in the season. They are a mid to late season pest of apples, many vegetable crops such as tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, and some squash, as well as soybean and hardwood trees. Now, this is considered to be an arboreal species, so these hardwood trees are very important in its life cycle. The nymphs can develop on tree fruit and can cause injury throughout their life stage. And there's some host plants that we're finding are better reproductive hosts, or ones that the nymphs can develop on, versus ones that are truly just a feeding host for the adults. Now, so this complicates management plans, but also the behavior of high mobility is also very complicated. Stink bugs will readily move between host plants dependent upon the plant phenology. They prefer to feed on a reproductive structure, so they like that seed pod or that fruit, and they will move to different plants and even different varieties of those plants depending on the certain ripeness of those plants. Now we know that the nymphs are also mobile, so the nymphs will also move between host plants. We don't know how far they will move or what life stages are moving, but they will move, and that's really important for management. The adults are highly mobile, and they, in fact, within a 24-hour period, new research is coming out that shows that they can fly over 2 kilometers, with some adults flying over 50 kilometers at a time. Now, when the adults are ready to lay eggs, they will lay these eggs in an egg mass of about 28 eggs on the underside of a leaf. The eggs are light green when they're laid, and they're usually in some sort of triangular shape. The nymphs will then hatch out, and the first instars tend to aggregate around those eggs. From egg to adult, it takes about 35 days at 80 degrees. This is about 538 degree days using a base of 14 degrees Celsius. Now, a female can lay anywhere from 4 to, the average is 4 to 10, depending on temperature, with some females laying up to 18 egg masses in their lifetime. And it's this extended period of egg production that provides overlapping generations. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is a lag in reproduction from the females that are emerging from diapause or the new generation of females, and this is about 80 to 196 degree days, which translates to about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on temperature. Because we have overlapping generations, this complicates our monitoring and management programs. So to decipher this, I'm going to give you a little schematic here. In blue, this is the overwintering adults that are emerging from diapause. This is a sample of a population that we would see here in the mid-Atlantic states, primarily in New Jersey. Those populations we see a peak in those populations in mid to late May, continuing a little bit into June, at which time we start to see nymphs. Some of those offspring then become the first generation, which begins to peak mid-July through mid-August, and this is again because those females are laying eggs continuously. If we get a second generation, those adults, we're starting to see this now, are starting to appear mid-September through mid-October. But the problem here is that we have nymphs present throughout the growing season, so we have very mixed populations that we're dealing with. Both eggs, adults, and nymphs are present at almost the entire season from June through October. If we look at this within a real life stage, we can actually apply the degree day model that's been developed. And this is a sample from peaches. Here's this early season peak of these adults that are coming out of overwintering. And then if you notice here, the adults kind of disappear. But that's when we start to see the nymphal population here in gray. Now, if we apply the phenological model based on the time that we find the first egg mass in the field, so we accumulate 538 degree days, that coincides with this peak that we see here around 700 degree days, indicating that we have our first generation adults. If we add in the maximum time allowed for those adults to become reproductively mature, we see we have another late season peak, and so this suggests that here in New Jersey that we are having that our first generation adults are becoming reproductively mature and have the potential to produce a second generation. Now, in order to decipher whether or not they are producing a second generation, I started looking at the reproductive status of these females to create a maturity index, and this has helped us to identify the number of generations throughout the region. We have done this at multiple sites, but again, I'm going to present you data from New Jersey. So this is the same slide you just saw with the population in peach. And I know these numbers look very low in terms of the population, but they are higher. The sampling was done at a time that's not very, is done at not the optimum time of day. But we can see that these first adults that are moving into the orchard around 100 degree days are reproductively mature, and that coincides with the timing of the first egg mass. So these few adults that we find here in the field are reproductively mature, but more importantly, this shows us that we do have that these first generation adults are in fact becoming reproductively mature, so we do have 2 generations, or at least 1.5 generations here in New Jersey. Now, a phenological model is important because it helps us to predict populations and life stages when we have these overlapping generations. And this is especially important when we have a landscape level pest, such as brown marmorated stink bug. Because we have these 100 different host plants that they can feed on at any different time of the year, one of the things that we're looking at is the sequence of these host plants. So within our typical mid-Atlantic diversified farm, we have multiple host plants. We have invasive tree of heaven, or ailanthus, and then along the wood edge here we have not only native trees such as maples and elms and willows, we also have invasive multiflora rose, we have wild raspberry, so we have a multitude, pokeberry, we have lots of hosts that can support development or at least short periods of feeding. They will then move throughout the landscape, whether it's to peaches or apples, they'll go to corn, they can go to the vegetable crops. So they really are a landscape level pest moving from host plant to host plant depending on the phenology of those crops. Now I mentioned that it's a sucking insect as a stink bug. So when brown marmorated stink bug feeds, it inserts its mouth part, which is essentially a long straw, into its food source. When it does that, it excretes digestive enzymes that kill the cells surrounding that, and over time those cells become corky or discolored, and eventually creating a sunken or depressed site. So I'm going to show you some damage pictures of some of the damage that brown marmorated stink bug can cause. Here's a picture of damage to apple, and all these dark spots here, you can see here, these are the depressed spots. Those are done by brown marmorated stink bug feeding late season in these apples. That's what the fruit looks like if you peel it back, and in 2010 it was estimated that there was a $37 million loss in production value from brown marmorated stink bug alone in the mid-Atlantic region to apples. So this is a considerable economic pest on many levels. That estimate only includes apples. It doesn't include peaches, which the damage can occur very early in the season on. As you can see, this is still a young fruit, and it has these brown corky spots. As this fruit develops, it will become cat-faced or pitted and gummy as well. And they will also have these sunken, depressed marks on them. Here's what the damage looks like in pepper. All these white spots, or what we call halo spots, are stink bug feeding, and you can see what that looks like on the outside of the pepper here. Feeding can also cause the fruit to abort if it's done early enough in the development of the fruit. Here's some damage to sweet corn. All these kernels that are stink bug feeding damage, and of course this one is curling because of stink bug injury. Here's some twisty okra that's caused by brown marmorated stink bug feeding. Here again are the halo spots in tomato as well. Now in soybean it causes damage, but what's really interesting that we're seeing in soybean here is a stay green effect. And you can see here, I hope, that this edge of the field is still green. And this is because brown marmorated stink bug, because of this mobile behavior, is a very perimeter-driven pest. So that their movement and dispersal or flight will actually be arrested when they come into a suitable host plant. And that typically happens along the edge. And we're starting to look at management programs that are designed just to manage brown marmorated stink bug around the edge, such as sprays around the border or trap crops. And insectary strips to enhance natural enemies along these borders. So this soybean crop, there's a lot of difficulties harvesting this because of this edge effect, and they can also injure the kernels, which can decrease oil yield as well as cause deformed pods or lack of seeds to form. Here's, oh, sorry, that was a picture of the aggregation that you can see in the fall. As you can see, there are some native stink bugs here. There's some acrosternum as well as some banasa, and there's a few Asian ladybird beetles in the mix here, but we do have very high populations that aggregate on the outside of human-made structures in the fall. So why is BMSB such a severe pest? One hypothesis that we've been tossing around a lot is that because of this overwintering behavior in these kind of human-made structures, that they're able to exploit this ag-urban interface. And so by this, they're kind of protected during their overwintering sites. And then because they're able to fly so long, they can reach suitable host plants at the critical times of the year. They also are feeding on multiple agriculturally important host plants. As I hope you have seen, they can feed on a wide variety, especially crops, agronomic crops, vegetables, fruit, and they are highly mobile. They're a perimeter-driven pest, and as an invasive species, they have a lack of natural enemies. On top of that, they have a different insusceptibility to insecticides, both conventional and organic, than our native species. And these insecticides that are effective have a very short residual period, so some of them are only effective for up to 3 days, and this is even a shorter window for some of our organic compounds. So to summarize the biology, we have a mobile polyphagous pest with overlapping generations. However, the degree day or phenological model that has been developed can help us to discern some of these peak timings for management. And we also know that it can cause significant injury to host plants. Now, in terms of monitoring, there are two main ways that we can look at this. One is we can look at it from the landscape scale. The second is an on-farm scale. From the landscape scale, this is initially a little difficult because we did not have a sex pheromone that was identified, and the aggregation pheromone that we were using at the time, which was the chiromone, was not, we didn't know the attractive distance of it, and it was not attractive at very long distances. And because it's a polyphagous pest, we can't just go to a single host plant like soybean and survey for the species. So what we decided to do was to employ citizen science. And this is, a lot of universities have started to do this for the stink bug, and there are websites that have been created, such as this one at Rutgers, where you can go online and learn about the stink bug, but you can also report a sighting or send in a specimen. So this has been very useful in helping to track the distribution and spread, especially at these outlying states. But one thing we did here, from an agricultural standpoint, is to use blacklight traps. And these blacklight traps, we have a series of anywhere as many as 80, but in general it's about 45 to 70 blacklight traps that are active at our vegetable IPM farms throughout the state. These are really useful non-specific monitoring tools. So we don't need to know anything about the species chemistry and very little about its biology in order to monitor for them. And it does provide us with some landscape level information. And it also allows, what we've found is that this allows us to monitor the populations both during spread as well as through establishment. Now, we were very lucky that this network was available to us, and we were able to document the attractiveness of brown marmorated stink bug to these blacklight traps throughout the state. And they're in New Jersey here, they're monitored from May to October for key pests such as corn earworm and corn rootworm, and now they're currently being monitored for brown marmorated stink bug. So here's a map, I hope you can see it, of what the population has looked like since 2004. In 2004, we had very, very low populations, and you can see it starts to spread in 2005. In fact, populations start to show up here in South Jersey. And now, as of 2011, you can see that it's present throughout the state in very high numbers. These black bands here mean that there's more than 1,000 caught per year on that farm. And so in 2011, we had 35,000 stink bugs, brown marmorated stink bugs that were caught, bringing our total for the whole program from 2004 on to 65,000 stink bugs, brown marmorated stink bugs that were caught through our black light traps. So this has been a very effective tool in helping us to identify the spatial spread throughout the state during this establishment phase. And it's very useful for these states that are along the outside fringe to use this tool. We were able to calculate that since 2004, the brown marmorated stink bug population in New Jersey has increased at about a 75% rate. And it has spread to about 2.8 new farms per year. We're starting to provide this information to growers on a weekly basis. So this is an image of a mean nightly catch of the stink bugs per farm. And so this is basically to provide growers information as to what's coming down the road. So how bad the pest is going to be this year. Now on farm, we can do two things. We can look at direct plant counts through 3-minute visuals or a certain area that we're sampling, or through sweep nets or blacklight trap, or sorry, sweep nets or beat sheets. Now, these are really good and they have a lot of value. However, you have to keep in mind that if you're doing direct plant counts, that this is a nocturnal insect. So its primary activities, we believe, are around midnight to 2 a.m. And they have very good evasive behaviors in the fact that they will drop off a host plant entirely if they sense you coming, or they'll switch to the other side of a leaf. So if anything, your counts are a very conservative estimate of injury of the pest population. So you should also supplement those with injury counts. I'm going to talk more about the aggregation pheromone work that's being developed by Tracy Leskey and her lab. They use this aggregation trap, which is a black pyramid, and this represents a tree, so it's a tree mimic, and the stink bugs will fly towards it and arrest their flight, or the nymphs will walk and they move up the trap into the top where they're attracted to the aggregation pheromone. Now it's an aggregation pheromone, which is good in the sense that it attracts both males and females and nymphs. However, it's not a specific point source, so you can attract more stink bugs to the general area. But the true pheromone has been identified of brown marmorated stink bug, and dose response studies are being conducted, as well as purity of the compound has been evaluated. And the good news here is that the purity of the compound is not a concern, which means it's going to be a very economical option for our stakeholders. Tracy Leskey's group has also identified that there is some synergy when this number 10 compound is combined with compound A. So now we have 10 plus A, and there are plans for commercial release, patent pending, in 2013. However, we are still working out how these are useful in a management tool, but we do know that are highly attracted to brown marmorated stink bug, so it may be a really good way to identify populations in your area, as well as to look at the seasonality. The problem with the good thing about this number 10 compound is that it's very attractive early in the season, whereas the previous compound that we were using, the MDT, was not attractive early in the season. So now we have an early season compound that is attractive throughout the late season, and then of course this is increased when we add the 10 plus A. So we know now that we can use blacklight traps for monitoring throughout the landscape. On-plant counts are very useful and they should be utilized. However, you just need to keep in mind that these counts can be variable. And the aggregation pheromone has been identified and is hoping to be commercially released in the summertime. Now I'm going to go through some of the preliminary data in organic systems that myself and some of my collaborators have accumulated. I mentioned when I started that we have received funding from the USDA OREI to develop organic management of brown marmorated stink bug using a whole farm approach. And so to summarize this up, what we're doing is we're investigating the dispersal behavior of both the adults and the nymphs. within the farmscape, so within an organic farm, and trying to integrate these with the core organic pest management strategies that we feel are important or have promise for brown marmorated stink bug. And this was developed through discussions with a lot of organic growers and with researchers that are familiar with organic management tactics. So we're going to be looking at conservation biological control to enhance the natural enemy populations, habitat manipulation, including trap crops, as well as barrier fabrics. We are identifying, because of the biology and this mobile behavior of brown marmorated stink bug, we don't feel that any single one management tactic is going to suffice. So we're looking to integrate multiple management tactics on farm that are both cost effective and effective, that organic farmers and growers can employ for managing both brown marmorated stink bug as well as our native stink bug species, because we haven't forgotten about them. And in fact, we're looking at this management at different invasion levels. So some of these outlying states like Kentucky and Tennessee and North Carolina, they still have very high populations of our native stink bugs. And so we're looking at kind of this switch in both natural enemy behavior as well as pest populations as brown marmorated stink bug increases in population density, and we expect it to become the dominant species. We are conducting extension activities through eOrganic, through field days, as well as through social media. Now, I already presented information by Tracy Leskey's group on the aggregation traps. I'm going to also be talking about movement patterns by Dr. Younglock Park at West Virginia, and I'm going to be talking about some trap crop work that Dr. Clarissa Mathews and her husband Haroon Halak have been working on at their farm, as well as some biological control. So Dr. Park's approach has been to take this whole farm approach, and this is very important because, as I've mentioned, brown marmorated stink bug has such a wide host range with so many crops that are host plants, and because of this highly mobile behavior. So if we can understand the movement patterns and in fact the sequence of host plants throughout the growing season, we can better monitor and we can better time our management applications of the population, and to identify things that maybe create these hot spots or cold spots, as they call them. So here's one snapshot of, I think this was in July. The red is the hot spots of brown marmorated stink bug activity, and the blue are the cold spots. So to put this in a little bit more context, what Dr. Park has seen is that the hotspots move during the growing season, which is what we expect. And so one of the sequences that has kind of hold true on the farm that he's been working on is that they move from the buildings to the berry crops or to the peaches, and then they move to your vegetable crops such as tomato, and they're also moving to apple at that time, and then they move to the field crops before again returning to their overwintering sites. And what's really great is that this data that he's shown is holding true regardless of the pest pressure. So this showing a lot of promise, and we're going to be expanding this research quite a bit in the upcoming years. One anecdotal piece of evidence he wanted me to share with you is that there is a preference to sweeter varieties of both tomatoes and peppers. And in fact, one of my colleagues here at Rutgers is trying to look at host plant resistance in some of the hot peppers that don't seem to be a very favored host plant of brown marmorated stink bug. Now, the second part that I'm going to talk about is the research of Dr. Mathews on trap crops. And this, again, is also a focal point of our bigger proposal. So she investigated two potential host plants, green amaranth and sunflower, and these were mixed planting as a trap crop surrounding cash crops. And these trap crops were baited with the rescue trap, which is the commercial version of the pheromone that is available. If you look at the picture here, you can see the sunflower trap crop baited with the rescue trap. Now, unfortunately, I mentioned that this was a mixed planting, but the green amaranth was overcome by weed pressure, so this really just became a sunflower trap crop. But we will be trying to identify the best trap crop through this through the OREI project. And she sampled these weekly for stink bugs as well as natural enemies, but the trap crop was not managed for controlling brown marmorated stink bug. As you can see here, there was very high populations of brown marmorated stink bug. They do love the sunflowers. They will feed on sunflowers throughout the season, even after it has dropped its seed, which is really great as a trap crop or as a potential trap crop. However, they did make it in and were feeding on the okra and on the tomato. And you can see that tomatoes and the okras are both pretty beat up by stink bug feeding. But what in general she concluded here is that even though there was no control measures taken to the trap crop itself, in general, especially to tomato, there was a lower level of damaged fruit per planting. And she excluded squash because of squash bug here. But there was a significant reduction in the number of brown marmorated stink bug eggs and nymphs in those trap cropped fields. So this is showing a lot of potential, and we're going to start investigating management in the trap crops as well. Now, the last bit of this is the biological control. So now, especially in organic systems, biological control plays a pivotal role in the management practices here. Now, stink bugs are generally controlled, or more commonly controlled, through egg parasitism, which are these wasps that lay their eggs inside stink bug eggs. So instead of stink bugs coming out, you get a whole bunch of egg parasitoids or wasps. And there is some classical biological control programs going on that are directed by Kim Hoelmer to bring over egg parasitoids from the country of origin. However, these are still many years away from release. So right now we're trying to look at ways we can enhance the predation that's going on in organic systems by our natural by our natural enemies that are already present there. And we have found that the spine soldier bug, which is a predatory stink bug, as well as the big-eyed bug, are very good predators. The big-eyed bug mostly of the eggs and the younger instars, but the spine soldier bug can attack the adults as well. Now, ants are also an important predator, especially of the egg masses. But here's an image that Dr. Park took of the spine soldier bug feeding on brown marmorated stink bug adult. So they will feed on them, even though this is typically known for feeding on caterpillars. So this is showing some good potential. Now, another management tool commonly employed in organic systems, of course, is organic insecticides. Now, we have started to evaluate some biopesticides or organic compounds against both the adults and the nymphs. This is work done a lot by myself and by Dr. Dively at University of Maryland. Azera, which is a combination product of pyganic and azadirachtin, works really well in both systems against adults and nymphs. That's showing a lot of progress. Venerate, which is a new product that's coming out by Marone Bioinnovations, as well as Impede, are also showing good laboratory efficacy and reduction in feeding injury in tree fruit, which is really positive. Now, pyganic, kind of the traditional go-to, is not one of the best compounds that we have. It does have good knockdown activity of the adults and the nymphs, but they recover very quickly, in part due to that short residual period. Now, pyganic and Impede, at least, do also cause mortality of the spine soldier bug, which, as I just showed you, is a very important predator in the system. So we need to balance the insecticides that we use with our natural enemies, of course, so that we can create a very healthy ecosystem within our farmscape. So we're looking at trying to identify some of the safer insecticides, organic insecticides, that in terms of natural enemy mortality as well. So I know I just threw a lot of information at you, but I do want to, there is some hope. There's some light at the end of this very long tunnel here. We are seeing predation increasing. This is a little bit crop dependent, but it does seem that some of the natural enemies, at least here in the mid-Atlantic states, are starting to parasitize the population. And this is increasing more. We're hoping that we'll see more of this in organic systems because of the enhanced biodiversity that's inherent there. The aggregation pheromone has been identified, and this is going to be a very good monitoring tool and potentially even a management tool. And we do have a phenological model, and this phenological model allows us to help predict some key management times. And I didn't go into that, and I apologize, but we do know that we have an early season peak of about 80 to 100 degree days, and a mid-season peak in the populations from about 700 degree days, and then again at 1,000 degree days that are key periods for adult management. And then for the nymphs, we kind of need to manage those from June to mid-July, continuously based on pressure. So, we do have a few organic insecticides that are available, but again, we need to look at the impact on natural enemies before we use these in high numbers. Now, the behavior, landscape, host plant selection, and sustainable control are still unknown, but hopefully, when we started this conversation with a lot of the organic growers involved in the OREI grant, they were pretty much hand removing egg masses and nymphs from host plants and from their cash crops. And we'd really I think we've gotten to the point now where we have a little bit of data that we can move beyond that and the two brick method that they were joking about. So with that, I'd like to
Unmuted.
thank eOrganic for hosting this webinar, and I'd like to thank Rutgers for funding a lot of this early work, as well as NIFA for providing a lot of funding for this group of 20 researchers to conduct this work on organic management solutions for brown marmorated stink bug. And then specifically for this talk, I'd like to thank George Hamilton, Tracy Leskey, Clarissa Mathews, Young Lock Park, Galen Dively, Saruti Hooks, Matt Grisham, as well as the whole brown marmorated stink bug organic working group. So with that, if there's any questions.
We're getting quite a few questions coming in, so let's get started. Let's see, we have a couple of questions coming in about chickens. For example, well, I'll sort of ask both of them at the same time here so you can get an idea of what's coming in. How effective is the use of chicken in brown marmorated stink bug control? And then there was another listener who was wondering whether anybody is brush vacuuming, collecting them for feeding to chickens, fish, or pigs. So if you could talk about that.
This question actually came up in some of our working group discussions. And essentially, some chickens will eat them. I've seen pictures on the internet of chickens eating bowlfuls of them. My chickens don't particularly like them. So I don't want to say it's a possible tool. It's not one we're investigating through this OREI program because there are some food safety concerns if you're releasing them into your plots, of course. Now, if you're vacuuming them up and feeding them to the chickens, you might need to kind of put them in some water first so that they cannot fly away as easily. It's possible. I would definitely try it. One thing we don't know about is taint of the smell from their scent glands in the eggs. So nobody has reported that yet, but it's just something you want to be cognizant of, unless they're broilers.
And another question about that would be whether any residual pesticides that might be on them would be too high to consider that practically.
Right, but in an organic system,
yeah,
most of the residual would be low.
Okay, we have some more questions about what would you do if they have entered a residential dwelling?
We get this question a lot. So the best way to control them inside the house is to prevent them from entering the house at all. So we always recommend caulking your windows, removing window air conditioners the beginning of September before their flight starts. So really try to prevent them from coming in the first place. Once they're inside, the best management tool is to simply vacuum them up using a shop vac. One thing, if you have very high populations, you can do is actually stuff a stocking down the vacuum hose so that they will all get collected there and they won't go into the shop vac itself. And then you can just tie that up and throw it in the garbage. But still, actual physical removal is the best management tool inside the house. We don't recommend, and I'm saying we as in the broad, scientific community here, we don't recommend managing them with insecticides inside your house because if they die, they can then bring in larger pest problems. there are some pest control companies that are offering management on the exterior of your houses, kind of a treatment, an exterior insecticide treatment, but I haven't seen any data on the effectiveness of that.
Okay. A question about whether brown and rough stink bug natives are beneficial or if they're also pests.
The brown stink bugs are pests. The rough stink bug, it goes back and forth between the literature as to whether or not they're predators or herbivorous. So, herbivorous. Sorry. So they're mixed, but they're very, very low population densities. It's not a very common stink bug. But the brown stink bugs are definitely pests.
Okay. A modeler from China indicates indirectly that the brown marmorated stink bug will probably not establish successfully in Florida. Do you agree with that? We continue with adult single detections, but no colonies, no winter reports of house invasions, no damage reports from growers. They will be continued to be introduced in Florida at higher rates as the population grows in the Northeast. So if you could comment on that.
Right, you're talking about the article from Zoo.
Yep, that's what she was talking about.
Plus one. So that's a very good question. There is one area in China, in the southern region of China, where they have 4 to 5 generations per year. And this is kind of a more tropical location, very similar to Florida conditions. They are not as prevalent there as they are in other regions of China. So in that sense, the model would accurately predict that the population is not going to be as abundant in Florida. Now, I have seen other people run similar models based on different parameters, and they see a much broader distribution of BMSB throughout the country. So it's a difference in which parameters you use for these models, but it is taking a considerably long time for them to get to some of the southern regions, even though we had a detection in Florida a few years ago. So hopefully the populations will not be as bad, because they will feed on citrus.
Okay. This is a question from the Willamette Valley in Oregon. He was wondering if there is a link that you might be able to refer people to, or that we could also put on the recording page, about all the known host plants of brown marmorated stink bug.
We are working to assemble that, so Alice, can I post something later about that?
Yeah.
Okay. We can provide supplemental information on that. The list is very long. There's a lot of hardwood trees. There's a lot of kind of woody shrubs, as well as agronomic crops. So there are some researchers. I have a list that I've worked off of from our early studies of ornamental plants, but that list keeps growing. Some of the prime host plants I can go over on. The top 10 ones are Paulownia, which is princess tree. Tree of Heaven, which is Ailanthus. Both of those, neither one of those are native. We do see them on maples. We can find them on hollies and butterfly bush, and even some rose plants. They will feed on squash. They will feed on raspberries. They'll feed on tree fruit. They'll also feed on tree nuts. They'll feed on eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, corn, and they'll even feed on Swiss chard.
Okay, well, we'll see if we can post some additional information on that on the same page as the webinar recording. Is there any evidence of birds eating brown marmorated stink bugs, especially woodpeckers?
I don't know specifically about woodpeckers, but yes, we do have evidence of birds eating them. The question is, and bats as well. The question is whether or not they are eating enough of them, because their scent gland is, they are stink bugs, and so they have a scent gland, and it is, it has evolved to defend against predators such as birds.
Okay. Also, whether spiny shoulder stink bugs are being produced for release as a pet predator.
So you can buy spined soldier bug. I don't know if it's the eggs or the adults, but you can purchase them from some biological control companies. You can also purchase their aggregation pheromone. And some research, Younglock Park is doing that research to see if there's a correlation between adding the spine soldier bug pheromone will increase predation of brown marmorated stink bug in those areas.
Okay, we're having a couple questions about the distribution of brown marmorated stink bug in the western United States. One person wanted to know in general about the West, and another listener wanted to know whether there are specific areas in California where they've been found.
So in California, the population has been there for a while, but it does not seem to be a very heavy population. That population was found in Los Angeles. They have had numerous detections and interceptions. Sorry, they've had numerous interceptions in Sacramento, but I believe that they have started to see populations in the field in the Yolo County area. Populations are increasing in Oregon, especially around Portland. There's researchers in the Hood River Valley that are doing research, and they're seeing significant increases, and they believe they're also seeing some injury to filbert nuts. And in terms of Washington, I think it's starting to creep over from the Oregon border.
Okay, a couple questions.
The rest of those populations are just detections.
Okay. A couple questions about trap crops. By green amaranth, do you mean pigweed?
So the green amaranth that was used is actually an African variety. But yes, green pigweed is kind of the common host that you can see around here. So that's the common name of it, yes. And it's attractive. However, it suffered very high weed pressure, and so it didn't make it. It was outcompeted by the sunflower. So, but the trap crops, what the best trap crop is something that is a very large component of this this proposal, this grant that we have funded. So we hope to be able to identify the best trap crop, both for vegetable crops as well as for field crops. And then we'll be looking at the natural enemies within that trap crop, and we'll also be looking at movement between the trap crop and the cash crops.
Oh, also we had an eOrganic webinar, which is in our archive by Russell Mizell, which was about trap crops.
Yep.
So you might want to check that out in our webinar archive. You can see the link in the chat box and also on the screen here. Another question about trap crops: do you I can't say that. Do you disc down the trap crop at a certain point in the season?
So we have not. Basically we have 1 year of data on it so far, and those trap crops were not managed. So what we plan on doing this year is to look at management within the trap crop. We don't specifically plan on disking them because then you're going to have a very significant lag in the period where you have a potential host. So what we're looking at is doing a single planting instead of multiple successive plantings of the trap crop. So we're looking at management. We're going to investigate flaming. We're going to investigate using the aggregation trap. We're also going to investigate using some different insecticides. And we're going to look at the impacts of those on managing the population, because we know that the trap crops are attractive, but they will also move from the trap crop onto the cash crop. And so that's what we want to prevent. We want to find the right trap crop for the right time of management, but also one that we can control the stink bugs on before they get into those cash crops.
Okay, this is a question from New Jersey. It says, how effective are these control kits that are turning up in the big box stores like Home Depot? I realize this is not much use for my farm, but I also do volunteer work for the Master Gardeners, and this is a big problem in New Jersey.
Can they elaborate a little bit about what those control kits are?
Yeah, if the questioner could just type in a little more information about that.
There are some traps, such as that rescue trap, that are being sold as a homeowner trap, and I believe those are for garden use, as well as there's other traps for inside the home for overwintering populations, and those have met with mixed success. So some of them are really effective at attracting the stink bugs inside the home once they're already there. The rescue trap will definitely attract the stink bugs late in the season, and so it can be a good removal tool. But I would not rely on that as your um, sole management strategy. So, but if you can elaborate a little bit about those control kits.
Okay. Meanwhile, here's a comment from someone with chickens. She says, my chickens eat them. It was in early winter when other insects were fairly non-existent, so perhaps introducing brown marmorated stink bugs to chickens might be done in the fall.
So those must have been for the overwintering populations.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So it's a good food source for them if they'll eat it.
Yeah, here's another one about trap crops. It says effective use of trap crops often includes some method of killing or removing the pests on the trap crop. For example, bug vacs, tractor-mounted vacuums, have been used extensively in California for lygus management in organic strawberries. Has your group conducted experiments that include methods of killing or removal of stink bugs on the trap crops?
Right, so I just mentioned that we are looking at management within the trap crop. The data I presented earlier was just 1 year of data, and one of the things that Dr. Mathews really emphasized was that she really believes, and she's a researcher, but she's also a farmer. She really believes that if we were able to control and remove the stink bugs from the trap crop, it would have been much more successful. And so we are looking at, I forgot to mention, we are looking at the vacuum sampling removal, and we're looking at flaming, we're looking at insecticides, we're looking at aggregation pheromone traps, so, and anything else we come up with. But we definitely are looking at management. In fact, we've bumped that up in our timeline because of the results that Clarissa got.
Okay. Can you recommend a place where people might be able to find a list of organic insecticides that would be effective for brown marmorated stink bugs?
The ones that I provided are pretty much the list.
Okay, yeah, and you can find the slides in the PDF, which
Right,
you
so
should
that
see
would
the
be
link for.
Azera, Impede, Venerate. Pyganic will give you some good knockdown ability, but there's no residual. Some safer soap will work, especially against the nymphs. The nymphs are a really good target for these organic insecticides because they have less cuticle, they have a softer cuticle, and they're not as mobile, so they're not going to move away from the crop as readily. So, targeting that, if you see nymphs, especially from June through mid-July, that's when you really want to target your control against the nymphal stages using some insecticides if that's the management tool you're going to use. Don't, if you see one, there's more. That's a really good take-home message. Don't just assume you have one and that's it. But remember, each egg mass has 28 eggs. So if you see one nymph, it's very likely that all their brothers and sisters are there too.
Okay. What wasps could be purchased to reduce brown marmorated stink bug population?
There are none available for purchase right now.
Okay. I was just looking to see if we have any more information on these. Oh yeah, on the kits. Okay, it says that some of the big box stores sell attraction kits and chemicals that are supposed to kill them, and she wasn't sure if they just attracted them more rather than killed them off.
Well, if they have compounds that are attractive, it's probably that MDT, or that aggregation pheromone. That's not the true pheromone of the stink of brown marmorated, but it will attract adults and nymphs late in the season. So you could use it for that, and that's probably one of those rescue traps that I mentioned earlier. The chemicals, I'd have to see which chemicals are being suggested for use. There's a lot of variation in the efficacy of different chemicals.
Okay.
So I would be wary.
Okay. Here's someone wondering whether there's been any research into the damage of brown marmorated stink bugs to high Brix fruit and vegetables versus lower Brix.
So that's a really good question, whether or not Brix content is making it a difference. I have data on that from grapes, but we have not analyzed it yet. All I can tell you is that we do see that they seem to be attractive to the fruit as it's ripening, but not when it's overripe. They also do prefer some sweeter varieties of peppers and tomatoes, and I don't know if that has anything to do with the Brix content or if it's other allelochemicals within the fruit itself. So good question. It's something we're investigating in blueberries and in grapes at least.
Okay, if you could talk a little more about the difference between squash bugs and brown marmorated stink bugs. This from a grower who was decimated in their winter squash, and now they're wondering whether if it was actually squash bugs instead of brown marmorated stink bug.
Can we go back to that slide?
Yeah, let me see if I can
Could you
get back there. I gotta
So
find it here.
basically, they're about the same size, although squash bugs are a little longer. Squash bugs are going to be U-shaped, so their shoulders are going to be the same width as the the edge of their abdomen, whereas stink bugs are always shield shaped. So their shoulders are wider than the tips of their abdomen. Oops, right there.
Okay, yeah. Let's see which
Down
one.
two more.
Okay, right here. Okay, there we go. So that's the brown stink bug.
It's okay. It's the next one.
Okay, yeah, there we go.
So the squash bugs also don't have this, they don't have the white banding on the antennae, and that's a really good indicator for both the nymphs and the adults. They do have some banding, but for a brown marmorated stink bug, it's very obvious that they have this white banding. But as you can see here, this is a squash bug. Well, this is a leaf-footed bug, and this is a squash bug. Both have shoulders that are about the same width as their abdomen, whereas the stink bug, the shoulders would be out in this direction. They also tend to have longer legs, but these are U-shaped or oval-shaped versus a shield-shaped. And for squash bug, at least, their nymphs are green and black versus red and black. But I would really suggest that you collect some specimens next year and take them to your cooperative extension office and have them identified.
Okay. Do any of the native stink bugs also overwinter inside homes?
That's a good question. In general, no. You will see an occasional stink bug inside homes that is a native stink bug, especially the Bronchomina species will occasionally overwinter in homes, but from what we know, nowhere in the same quantity as brown marmorated stink bug. Most of the other stink bug species will overwinter in leaf litter or underneath tree bark.
Okay. Here's a question about whether damage has been documented in cotton production in any of the states in the Mid-Atlantic. This person is interested to see the potential for the pest to move into cotton in the Southeast.
That's a very good question. I personally think that there's a lot of potential for them to move into cotton. Ames Herbert at Virginia Tech is starting to look at this a little bit more, and I believe, I hope I'm not misquoting him here, but I believe that he has found that they will injure cotton and that they do so at a different phenological stage than the native species. So from what I gather, they will feed on cotton. We don't grow any cotton here in New Jersey, but they will feed on cotton and they will damage it. And this is not surprising given Lygus and the green stink bugs that are found so abundantly in cotton. So I think it's definitely something to be on the lookout for.
Here's another comment from the questioner from Florida. She said they've had several detections in Florida per year, and she said that if it does establish successfully, they expect, as you said, 3 to 5 generations per year. So they don't look forward to its establishment and are hoping it won't establish itself in the entire state. So, let's see. Here's a question about whether any plants repel brown marmorated stink bug.
So as of what we know right now, we don't know of any plants that specifically repel BMSB. However, there are some hot pepper varieties, like the really, really hot pepper varieties, that are showing promise as in terms of reduced feeding on those plants. So we're, if this holds true through multiple seasons, we're hoping to either, do a combination of tactics of maybe using those to see if we can use those to repel the bugs, or to see what characteristics there are so we can use those and try and bring those out in some of the other pepper varieties.
Okay, here's a question about whether vegetation in natural areas is damaged by brown marmorated stink bug.
Yes, they will feed on numerous host plants within our natural landscape. And we've recently found a lot of damage occurring in nurseries, in ornamental nurseries, especially on the hardwood trees, where they will feed directly on the bark and cause kind of gumming and bleeding of the bark to occur.
If you could talk a little bit about the distribution in the Midwest.
So we have some detections in the Midwest, but they're still really low. We don't believe we've even started to see nuisance problems. In Michigan, Michigan's kind of on the border there. So Michigan, the populations were first detected in 2010, 2011, and this year they're starting to see populations in homes in greater numbers. So there is about a 3 to 5 year lag before the time we start seeing them in homes and the time we start seeing them in agricultural crops. And then there's an even greater lag between the time they start becoming a real pest in those crops. So I think that there's still some time there for the Midwestern states.
Okay, well, we're running out of time, so I'd like to thank everyone for all the questions and mention once again that you can find our many other recorded presentations on organic farming topics at the link on your screen.